Welcome to the deep dive. We're taking a close look today at the history of Slovakia based on, well, quite a stack of sources you've shared with us.
That's right.
This material offers a really comprehensive journey. I mean, from the earliest human traces right up to modern challenges and identity.
It really does. These sources, they paint a vivid picture across centuries, touching on geography, culture, politics, economics. It's truly a deep dive into what shaped this nation. Our goal really is to navigate this together, pulling out the most important threads, maybe some surprising facts, just to give you a solid framework for understanding Slovakia's, let's say, complex past.
Exactly. Our mission is to distill this rich history, highlighting what's crucial. And the sources, they immediately situate Slovakia for us. A turbulent heart of Central Europe, right?
Yeah.
Bordered by several key countries, Czech Republic, Poland, Ukraine, Hungary, Austria, and dominated by the largely mountainous Carpathians.
And that geography isn't just a backdrop.
No, definitely not. As we'll see, it's been a major player, influencing its history right from the very beginning.
And what's fascinating is how far back that beginning goes. The sources reveal that the land's been inhabited for an incredibly long time.
How long are we talking?
We're talking earliest human traces, going back over 280,000 years. Finds in places like Bratislava, Moravsky, Jan.
Wow, that's serious ancient history.
It is.
The sources even detail Paleolithic finds, like 30,000 to 10,000 BC, these Bovidian finds in Sandburg,
Yeah.
suggesting an early archaeological culture there.
Exactly. And we see evidence of Mesolithic settlements too. Then moving forward, the Neolithic period, maybe 6,000 to 2200 BC, left numerous finds, indicating distinct cultural branches moving in from the south. The sources specifically mention the Chalcolithic Langielsko-Kisaposteg culture,
Right.
noting things like chalet structures, earthworks, which, suggest growing complexity in how people organize themselves.
So this wasn't just empty land waiting for later arrivals.
Not at all. Continuous habitation, cultural development.
Okay.
The sources tell us about inhabitants in the second millennium BC Celts, Illyrians, Thracians. And they weren't just living there, they were building things, monumental structures, like grave mounds, tumuli, built with stone, found all over.
That points to a pretty organized society, significant burial practice.
Absolutely. And this rich prehistory, it really sets the stage before, well, the big shift brought by the arrival of the Slavs.
Right, the Slavs. When did they arrive?
Well, one source mentions Alpine Slavs in the 6th century AD. Another notes a larger migration, Slavs from Eastern to Western Central Europe, pushed by the Avars, maybe around the 9th century.
Okay, and here's where it gets really interesting, right? This leads directly to Great Moravia.
Yes. According to the sources, this was the first state unit of Slavs in this territory.
Founded when?
Around 833, under Prince Mojmir I. He had ties to the Western Franks. And one source points out that Nitra was already a key center even before that, maybe the main residence of a king of Pannonia, predating the full empire.
So Great Moravia was a pretty significant early Slavic state then.
Definitely. The sources note cultural moral development influenced by things like the arrival of Cyril and Methodius.
The Byzantine Slavs.
Exactly. And what's pivotal here, they brought Christianity and, crucially, the first Slavic written language, using Greek letters.
That must have fundamentally changed literacy, culture, everything.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
A monumental moment for Slavic identity.
And the empire, it reached its peak under Prince Svetopluk.
Described as formidable, and Mujamir, credited with unification.
But like many empires.
To face pressures.
Yeah.
The sources indicate its decline, the eventual split, were largely due to external forces,
Like who?
pressure from Germanic peoples, and importantly, the rise of the Hungarian state. East Franks attacked, conquered parts, and the Hungarians effectively stopped its expansion, contributed to its fragmentation. Even other groups, Mohawks, Tatars, played a sort of minor role in slowing its end.
And the long-term result, according to the sources.
Well, the Slovaks became separated from the Moravians, ended up mainly under the influence of the East Franks, and more significantly, the Hungarians.
So by the 11th, 12th centuries,
They were distinct, as sources put it, an isolated and separate group.
which leads us right into the next huge chunk of time, a millennium under Hungarian rule.
Exactly. The material states Hungarian tribes annexed the territory, Upper Hungary, in 907, after Great Moravia's defeat. And one source describes this as the start of a, quote, 1,000-year period of often brutal Magyar colonization.
Brutal is a strong word. How did the sources describe that?
Well, they detail forced changes. Forced adoption of Roman Catholicism, which clashed with the Orthodox Christianity many had adopted earlier.
Right, from Cyril and Methodius.
Precisely. One source contrasts this with more tolerance elsewhere, calling it a blood-stained era for Slovaks in this context. Again, just relaying the source's perspective here.
Understood. What else?
They also highlight the implementation of feudalism, servitude, a structured tax system. Peasants reportedly stripped of goods, rights. The nobility, allied with clergy and monarchy, became dominant.
At the expense of the common people.
Right. And this system, described as oppressive, persisted until the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Wow. The sources mention a moral collapse starting around the 11th century.
Yes, deepening after 1384 when towns like Trnava became more German-dominated after a peace treaty.
But there's a positive note for the 14th century?
There is. A practical unification of the territory through a common language. Czech-Slovak. The sources say Slovaks actually insisted on using Czech, this mutual Slavic language, from around the 12th, 13th centuries.
Interesting. And later, under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburgs.
Slovakia was part of Hungary then, reduced to a province, basically, excluded from parliamentary representation. Pozsony, which is Bratislava today, became the ceremonial seat for crowning Hungarian kings. But even with that control, the sources mention resistance, conspiracies against the Habsburgs.
Okay, let's fast forward quite a bit to World War I. This period, the sources really emphasize, was pivotal.
Absolutely pivotal, forging a powerful and coherent Czechoslovak idea.
Czechs and Slovaks starting to seriously envision a joint homeland.
Yes. Figures like Tomáš Masaryk championed this, linking it to democratic self-determination, arguing against imperialism.
And he gained Allied support.
Through his diplomacy, yes. And this vision became reality. Czechoslovakia proclaimed October 28, 1918.
Right.
Sources describe it having solid territory, borders based on ethnic lines, though acknowledging significant minorities like Germans.
And the formation process, it wasn't instant, I assume.
No, it evolved from the wartime idea to creating institutions, but underlying tensions surfaced pretty quickly, especially in the 1920s.
What kind of tensions?
National problems, mostly. Conflicting ideas about citizenship, nationalistic versus unionistic, and mutual accusations.
Such as?
Well, the sources use terms like national traitors or describe actions as ethnocide. It sounds quite charged.
Definitely. And the Slovak perspective within this new state.
Seen as important, but also, according to the sources, causing fear among some Czech politicians. The belief in Slavic unity was there, but sources also mention a perception among some Czechs that Slovaks were, well, arrogant. Efforts were made to address the Slovak question. Concepts like Palaki Slovakism found support. But the initial introduction of Slovaks to Czech public opinion via journalism, the sources say, unfortunately resulted in an unfavorable view. One striking detail mentioned is interpreters apparently emphasizing Slovaks being beaten up by the Czechs, portraying a sense of marginalization from that viewpoint, again, relaying directly from the sources.
It's important to hear these different perspectives presented in the material. And interestingly, the sources also mention Slovaks in Serbia during WWI.
Yes, recognized as a national minority there. Active in their community, many were teachers, played a role in politics, even got parliamentary seats in the 1920s.
Okay, moving into the interwar period now. Slovak identity, a political reawakening.
Very much so, focusing on the national question and social questions. The call for autonomy became widespread, left and right.
And this is where figures like Josef Tiso emerge.
Correct. His Christian nationalism led the Slovak People's Party, the SLS, closer to Nazi Germany. Sources note growing mistrust among some Slovaks towards Czech intentions. A split in the broader movement, with Linka's SLS taking a more independent path, eventually allying with Czech nationalist Young Czechs.
And the push for federalism gained traction.
Yes, especially in the run-up to the Munich Agreement. That, combined with German threats, the material suggests the central government seemed unable to act decisively.
Leading to a loss of confidence.
That's the perspective presented. That Slovaks felt, quote, left alone to contend with a hostile Czechoslovak President Beneš, feeling hampered in asserting their position.
Which ultimately led to
the declaration of the Slovak Republic by Linka's Slovak People's Party, March 14, 1939.
Historically the first independent Slovak state.
According to the sources, yes. After years striving for self-determination within Czechoslovakia, including some limited autonomy.
And how did this new state operate?
Well, the sources detail how political nationalism intensified with the economic crisis. The Czechoslovak National Council reportedly repressed Slovak activities. The new Slovak Republic agreed to military assistance for Hitler's Reich, broke relations with the USSR in June 41, sent troops to the Eastern Front, issued anti-Soviet proclamations.
The sources call this a substantial hitch for Slovak nationalism.
They do. And tragically, the sources are explicit here. Within Slovakia's local nationalism at this time, there was a pronounced emphasis on condemning Jews. They state that Slovaks, with active or passive HE's cooperation, were directly involved in the process of destruction of Jews.
How? How involved?
The sources detail phases, pretense, looting, transit, and extermination. They mention grim specifics like people's audits cheering, references to figures like Cardinal JKHCT, and radio broadcasts assailing Slovaks. We are relaying this challenging information as presented in the sources neutrally.
Understood. A very dark period.
Indeed. One source contrasts this with the Czech lands, occupied earlier, which became more peripheral after 1939. This source views Slovaks as having become participants in a foreign policy alien to them. The sources also mentioned the 1944 Slovak uprising, heroic, but ultimately ill-timed and suppressed.
Right. So after World War II, we enter the communist era.
Yes. The coup in February 1948 established a totalitarian regime. Czech lands and Slovakia lasted 4 decades.
What were the immediate post-war issues?
2 main sources of unrest, according to the material: economic crisis and the Communist Party's determination to curb any Slovak autonomism.
And the economic situation spurred opposition.
It did. New movements like Civic Forum, Public Against Violence. The Slovak opposition developed strongly, separating itself from the cultural and political left.
The sources mention something curious: political oppression vanishing, then reappearing worse.
Yes. Virtually evaporated overnight, then reappeared still more severe a year later. Strange dynamic described there.
Setting the stage for things like the Prague Spring later on.
Exactly. The sources attribute that era of reform partly to a withdrawal of Lenin-inspired terror in the USSR, creating space for more liberal ideas within the Czechoslovak Communist Party, which led to Alexander Dubček's rise in '67.
And under Dubček.
The new leadership restored freedom suppressed since '48. Speech, action, organization, assembly, press, economic planning aimed for socialism with a human face. Dubček pushed reforms in January '68, but unlike reformers elsewhere, Czechoslovakia faced swift military intervention, USSR Warsaw Pact.
Which brought about the period of normalization.
Right. The sources suggest the political system seemed to fully revent. The National Renaissance foundered. Censorship, restructured government. Ruling National Front, new National Assembly reordered life. Slovak communists merged into the Czechoslovak party structure.
How is control maintained?
Described as a paratocracy, modeled on the USSR. Tight media control lead-off newspaper is mentioned. They even call the basic law fictitious, secrets held in Prague. One source notes 70% of publication capacity went to Czechoslovak accommodation, highlighting that centralized control.
And this long period of normalization, it eventually led to the Velvet Revolution.
Yes. The sources pinpoint the student demonstration in Prague, November 17, 1989, as the spark, ending 40 years of dictatorship.
And it spread quickly.
Within weeks, mass demonstrations countrywide, solidarity committees formed, media control shifted.
They characterized as peaceful, right? Velvet.
Relatively nonviolent, yes. A bloodless coup called Velvet, to contrast with bloodier transitions elsewhere like Romania.
And Václav Havel's election as president sort of marked the end of that initial phase.
Seen that way in the sources, yes. Closure to the revolutionary events.
What did the new government do first?
Started fulfilling promises. Reopened to world trade, color TV, people learned to vote again, election scheduled for spring '90, new name, new flags.
But it wasn't easy economically.
No, the sources note Czechoslovakia was hardest hit by the economic crisis during this time.
And then internal issues came to the fore, especially regarding Slovakia's future.
Exactly. Calls to redesign Slovakia within the Federation. Central nationalism reacting to perceived territorial plans. But despite differences, the sources say Czechs showed remarkable understanding of Slovak demands.
There's also mention of Transylvanian Slovaks.
Yes, asserting their rights. Influenced by Pan-Slavism, later anti-Hungarian, Slovak Catholic leaders reportedly feared their influence due to socialist ideas among them.
So the idea of a fully autonomous Slovak province?
Temporarily shelved, the sources say, but cultural and educational rights as a minority were recognized. Though the source calls recognizing minority rights for a group seeing itself as a nation unfathomable logic, a Slovak Institute was set up.
all leading towards the split of Czechoslovakia. How do the sources frame that?
It's presented with a specific viewpoint, that the split was practically forced on the Slovak side by the Czech partner and happened against the will of many Slovaks. This unprepared division meant many Slovaks, especially elites, struggled to identify with the breakup and the new state.
But the federation itself had underlying issues.
Oh, yes. Existing since 1920, based on ethnic criteria. Described as a compromised nationhood, initially okay, but huge differences. Territory, politics, economy, culture, identity made it uneasy. Federalism was argued for even as independence demands grew. Ethno-political mobilization for a nation-state peaked in the late 80s, and the Slovak political elite was apparently completely decimated before the '89 uprisings.
So the Slovak National Council reemerged.
As a key body, yes. Parliament focused on federalist ideas, protecting state property in that lead-up.
Which brings us to Slovakia as an independent nation, January 1st, 1993.
That's the date. The main tasks: strengthen statehood, integrate into European organizations.
And it gained recognition quickly.
Broad international recognition, yes. Austria was the first. And a clear consensus on foreign policy, EU and NATO membership.
What were the early years like economically under Mečiar?
Vladimir Mečiar's time, especially his return in '94, saw significant economic transformation, described as a painful transit. Sources suggest a lack of readiness for capitalism. They state the void left by the state was filled by a political-business phenomenon during his '94-'98 rule.
Characterized how?
As an unusual transition model, using auto-put policies that reportedly fueled corruption, patron-client networks. He also kept key banks publicly owned, which was different.
And politically.
His HCDS party dominated for over a decade. Sources described his methods as controversial, amending laws, trying to establish a party state.
But there was international pressure.
Yes, to keep democratic ranks. He lost the '98 elections.
Leading to the post-Mečiar era.
Under Miklas Derinda, a center-right coalition. A more moderate approach, new parties emerged. But they faced rebuilding the economy and institutions, which the sources suggest were damaged by the Mečiar years.
How did they approach that?
Market-oriented reforms, implemented quickly. Credible, ambitious legislation. Accommodating monetary and fiscal policies helped a quick recovery after the '98 crisis. Banking sector repair handled skillfully, sources say.
So improvements in stability.
Yes, macroeconomic performance improved. Though a fiscal imbalance appeared, rapid growth, foreign investment boosted optimism for meeting Maastricht criteria fairly quickly, exports grew, no major inflation or exchange rate crises.
But there was a downside.
Striking contrast highlighted. Rapid growth, but also increased poverty. Growing regional disparities, urban versus rural.
And EU integration, how did that progress?
Well, sources note Slovakia was seen as a bit of a maverick leading up to '99, accepted into OECD in 2001. EU entry ratified, the source says, April 2003. Institutions dismantled to comply. Post-accession rankings showed economic institutions were only marginally acceptable then.
Okay, let's look at modern Slovakia, the political landscape after Mečiar.
More moderate parties emerged. The political left remained fragmented. Sources expressed concern about the rise of the far right.
Focusing on what?
Immigration control, often using language described as dog whistle and racist. These positions are condemned by opposition, critics, youth groups, civil organizations.
And social issues. How does Slovakia compare, say, with Hungary?
Generally low levels but significant statistical discrepancies. Advantages in life expectancy, infant mortality, disadvantages in overall health status, disability-adjusted life years, comparisons on energy, healthcare, population, GDP, infrastructure, highlighting potential future tensions.
What broader societal changes are mentioned?
Transition from rural to urban, demographic shifts, behavioral changes, immigration creating new social and geographical issues. Sources suggest these aren't adequately perceived internally, local academia disregarded compared to trends in Hungary or Poland.
Foreign relations, what's the focus?
Traditionally, good relations with powerful neighbors. Visegrad Group, Czech Republic, Austria, key economic partner, Germany, Poland, trade intensified, historical ties to Hungary, Russia. Generally good neighborly relations reflected in policy. Issues with Hungary often seen in NATO context.
But Mečiar's return in '94 shifted things.
Sources say yes, a drift away from the West. Striving for an independent position, focus on Slavic-Russian environment. West integration removed from main orientation, NATO cooperation retracted. But integration with Central European countries continued. There was discontent abroad with Mečiar. NGOs, international orgs were critical. Lobbying for NATO integration happened separately.
And Slovak identity today, nationalism.
About 85% identify as Slovak. Significant Hungarian minority, around 500,000 in the south. Czechs, 60-80K west-north. Ruthenians, 50K northeast. Smaller groups too.
Religion.
Predominantly Roman Catholic, about 60%. Others, Lutheran, Calvinist, Orthodox, Adventist. Over a third report no affiliation.
Looking back at how identity developed, early 20th century.
Province of Hungary in the Habsburg monarchy. On the outskirts of the Czech cultural sphere, figures like Tiso, Jesuits focused on the hinterland. Czechoslovak nationalism gained influence. Sources note depression among intelligentsia favoring status quo versus anti-Habsburg agitation. Agitation for reorganizing the monarchy increased after 1895, linked to Czech rapprochement, rise of youngest Czechs, nationalist schools.
What about cultural activities?
Involved both Czechs and Slovaks. Operas, pamphlets, lecturers. Later Czech pro-Slovak movements advocated independence or union. Authors used Slovak cultural elements. Slovak operas performed even in Budapest.
Specific moments mentioned.
Kossuth-Respantan agitation responses. Censoring of a Tujovsky drama. Deportation of Anton Maker, a Hungarian pro-Slovak. Another Czech independence movement in 1880.
So a complex Czech-Slovak cultural interaction.
Very complex. Czech plays popular. Press published biographies, sometimes scandalous. Hungarian efforts to suppress things like Tisovek's heroic shrimp. Sources describe evolving Czech pro-Slovak views, some intellectual supportive. Contrast that with some Czech producers reportedly saying Best was pro-VD Slovaks, framed in the sources as an internal Czech experiment. Again, presenting as described.
Right. Okay, shifting focus to culture, tourism, education more broadly. How did the sources frame Slovak history culturally?
Fundamentally as the history of Slovaks as an ethnos, a language, a nation-state. Identifying with that, seeing Slovakia as homeland is key. Citizenship is more than just ethnicity.
And the diaspora.
Pointed out that Slovaks live globally, but studying cultural development often focuses just on historical Slovakia's territory due to circumstances.
Emphasizes considering Slovaks outside modern borders, too.
Urban culture played a role, a significant one. Several towns were centers of trade, wealth, culture printing guilds, fairs, until the Ottoman impact. Bratislava stood out by the late 15th century. Stone walls against Ottomans helped. Other towns mentioned. Aristocracy built castles. Some became cultural centers.
What about contributions to science and culture? Where does that story start?
Traced back to Great Moravia's mission. Rich cultural development noted. Cyril and Methodius bringing parchment, glass, books, and Old Church Slavic. The alphabet leading to first literature. Gymnasiums founded, Nitra leading. First printing mention. Trnava.
And later periods.
Fluctuations. A dearth of literature. Social decline, then regeneration via Protestant Reformation. Printing flourished. Evangelical and Catholic, efforts for literature and native language proverbs, glossaries, manuals compiled, checkbooks transported into Hungary. Hussite defeat led to literary chaos, Habsburg consolidation, Catholicization, closing school churches.
Jesuits were key, though.
Yes, established 6 organized educational institutions, gymnasiums. Slovak authors contributed to literary style, Trnava prolific. Protestants faced pressures, emigration. Bardejov printing house sometimes worked in Polish Czech.
So despite challenges.
Developments in linguistics, translations happened, sometimes even thanks to vernacular spread. Sources emphasize veritable gems of musical, scientific, artistic production were created.
Okay, let's talk tourism and heritage today. How is Slovakia presented?
As the authentic heart of Europe, escape, tranquility. Nature not overbuilt. Carpathians, caves, castles, ruins, churches, geological wonders, flora, fauna.
Activities.
Hiking, cycling, very popular. Slovaks enjoy walking in the countryside, direct tourists to paths. Geodiversity mentioned.
What about relaxation?
Wellness stays noted. 5-star hotels, thermal water, pools, spas. Bratislava as a happiness ladies getaway. Trendy cafes, restaurants, clubs, open-air cinemas. Compact city, travel hub. Nova Woods nearby.
Heritage site?
Several UNESCO sites listed. Earliest written evidence. Nitra Settlement Castle, 828. Took centuries for settlements to expand. Barbarian invasions halted some growth. Cities might be less populated than rivals, but some older than Western European capitals. Portrayed as birthplace of pan-European culture, extensive legacy, unique preserved monuments.
And rural culture.
Survived across large territory, origins in Old Slavs. Characterized by local dialects, architecture, crafts, mythology, customs, folklore.
Education standard.
Comparatively high degree indicated.
Compulsory.
615, 9 years. Significant number taught in language other than mother tongue, over 36,700 noted, though Slovak is state language. Right to education respected.
Higher education.
Public, state, private institutions. Over 900 total in 2011. Universities, higher professional schools. Academic Senate self-governance. Over 261,000 enrolled then, about 22.5% of cohort. Comparatively favorable situation, significant share over 30. Ministry of Education coordinates, independent bodies for exams, inspection.
All right, looking towards future prospects now, again, comparing with Hungary.
Yes. Sources highlight advantages and disadvantages for Slovakia. Advantages: favorable energy mix, better gov-debt GDP ratio, 1995-2015.
And disadvantages, where are the challenges?
Less favorable GDP growth per capita trend compared to Hungary. Hungary's R&D expenditure per GDP almost twice as high. Hungary had high unemployment, sustainability questioned. Slovakia saw employment increase, labor force participation higher in Hungary, gap narrowing. Voter turnout consistently higher in Hungary, areas needing improvement for Slovakia. Demography, corruption.
How has the standard of living compared over time?
Almost equal until late 80s. Diverging paths since market transition. Agricultural productivity shifted in Slovakia's favor. Human development improved more in Slovakia pre-crisis. But recently, Hungary's relative economic well-being improved significantly, narrowing the income gap.
Finally, the Slovak diaspora. What do the sources say?
Suggests more focus could be on immigration history, activities abroad, Hungary, U.S., Canada mentioned specifically.
Activities in the U.S.
Yes. Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Chicago. Influencing Slovak politics from overseas.
Yeah.
Detail about Mazurik visiting Ohio, expecting support but reportedly replying no, never, when asked to reconcile with Slovaks, relaying as stated.
Large U.S. Slovak population rallied during WWI.
Yes. Dinners, rallies, first Slovak organization, Slovak League of America, 1919. Sources mention context of distrust from Mizurikism Czechs towards Slovaks.
What other diaspora activities are noted?
Engaging League of Nations, 1920. Representation in Washington. Formation of Slovak National Council changed focus from autonomy to independence. Letter to U.S. Sec. State 37. Memoirs placed in diabolical light asserting legal, historical, and moral right to independent Slovakia. Strategy: keep the question burning.
Right.
Commission formed 1922. Slovak immigrants became firmer against Czechs. Yanni's a case mentioned. Lobbying U.S. Congress, thousands of letters described in sources controversially as breaching American public law. Again, reporting the source's framing. Activities against Slovaks reportedly ended post-independence 90s. Collection on Emigration, published 2000. Activity of barristers Dubecki, Schuster highlighted as vital.
And Ikefan Busek.
Mentioned. Worked with Slovaks in U.S., Mrs. Svoboda. Story of crossing to Slovakia, 1968, before low state period. Converted to Catholicism. One of 5 POVs released. Escaped with ambassador help. Lived long life. Called one of the most important contributors to the struggle by the sources.
Wow. That was a truly incredible deep dive through centuries of history.
He really was.
We've traced the story from, ancient human traces, early cultures, through powerful empires rising and falling, that long period under Hungarian rule, the complicated experience in Czechoslovakia, the tumultuous path to independence, and now the challenges, the integration efforts of the modern nation.
Indeed. It's fascinating, isn't it? Seeing how geography, external pressure, the internal struggle for national identity, cultural developments, how they've all continuously shaped Slovakia's journey. We've covered pivotal moments, periods of, profound oppression, but also remarkable resilience, and highlighted the key characteristics, the challenges of modern Slovakia, all based on the sources you provided.
It really gives you a sense of the depth, the richness of this nation's story. So many factors at play.
Definitely.
And looking at those future prospects the sources discussed, it's clear history's impact continues, both advantages and areas needing attention.
Absolutely. History is always a work in progress, isn't it?
Yeah.
But hopefully this deep dive has given you a solid foundation drawn directly from your sources.
Thank you so much for bringing us these sources and letting us explore them with you. We really hope this helps you feel well-informed about the history of Slovakia.
My pleasure. And as you consider everything we've discussed, particularly that long history of external pressures, the complex relationships with neighbors, here's a question prompted by the source material for you to ponder. How do you see this deep historical context continuing to influence Slovakia's national identity and its foreign policy choices in the world today? Something to think about.
That is definitely something to think about. Until next time, keep digging deeper into the topics that intrigue you.